"Do not drop anything," her aunt had said, not looking at her, not once. As the doors to the ballroom opened and the lights spilled in like something too bright to belong to her, and Eliza Whitmore stepped inside carrying a silver tray that felt heavier than it should have, heavier than polished metal and crystal glasses, heavier than expectation, heavier than the quiet understanding that she did not belong among the women already arranged beneath the chandeliers. The room stretched wide and gold and impossibly still, silk brushing against silk. Laughter softened into something practiced, measured, as if even joy had been rehearsed in this place, and she moved along the edge of it, careful, invisible, the way she had learned to be, her steps small, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid attention, but not enough to seem rude. The tray balanced steady between her hands, the faint clink of glass barely audible under the orchestra's slow, elegant rise, and yet it was the smallest misstep that broke it, not a stumble. Not even a full slip, just the slightest turn too sharp as someone brushed past her shoulder without apology, and the tray tilted, just enough, one glass sliding, then another, and then, sound, sharp and clean, crystal striking marble, the kind of sound that did not belong in a room like this, the kind that cut through conversation without effort, and everything stopped, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, as if the entire ballroom had been held in a single breath and forgotten how to release it. Eliza's hands froze midair, fingers still curved around nothing, her eyes fixed on the red spreading across the white floor, the wine blooming outward in slow, deliberate lines, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was not shock exactly, something quieter, something colder, the kind of pause that came before judgment. Then the whispers began, soft at first, then sharper. Names not spoken but understood, positions measured, mistakes noted. Her cousin's hand closed around her wrist, firm, controlled, pulling her back a step, then another, nails pressing just enough to remind her of her place. "Careful," she murmured, not unkindly, but not kindly either, and Eliza nodded though the word had not been meant for her ears, her gaze dropping again as she lowered herself to the floor, the fabric of her dress brushing against the marble as she reached for the fallen glass, her fingers steady despite the heat rising at the back of her neck. She had done this before, not here, not in a room like this, but elsewhere, always where it was expected, where it did not matter. She gathered the shards carefully, placing them onto the tray, the faint sting at her fingertip ignored, the red on the floor spreading wider now, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and she reached for a cloth, pressing it down, the fabric darkening as it absorbed what should not have been spilled, and then the doors opened again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a shift in the air that came before the sound, a subtle change that moved through the room faster than any announcement could have. The orchestra faltered, just slightly, enough to be noticed, enough to matter, and the whispers died without being told to. Eliza did not look up, not immediately. She did not need to. The stillness had changed, it had direction now, and she felt it before she saw it, a presence that did not hurry, did not demand, but altered the space simply by entering it. Footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, each one landing with quiet certainty against the polished floor, and the room responded without instruction. Shoulders straightening, voices lowering, attention shifting as if drawn by something unseen, and still she knelt there, her hand pressing the cloth against the marble, her breath steady, her focus fixed on the stain she could not fully remove, until the steps stopped, close enough that she could hear the faint creak of leather, close enough that the air itself seemed to hold, and for a moment, nothing happened, not a word, not a movement, just the space between one breath and the next, and then, quietly, not raised, not forced, but absolute in a way that left no room for hesitation, he spoke. "Stand." She did not move at first, not because she did not hear him, but because the words settled over her like something too precise to misunderstand, her fingers still pressed against the cloth, the faint scent of wine rising as it soaked through, and for a fraction of a second the entire ballroom seemed to suspend itself again, as if waiting to see whether she would obey. Her cousin's grip tightened at her wrist, a warning now, sharper. "Eliza," she whispered under her breath. But it was not her cousin's voice that held the room. It was his, and slowly, carefully, Eliza lifted her hand from the floor, the cloth slipping from her fingers, leaving a darkened imprint behind. She placed her palm against the marble for balance and rose. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a controlled steadiness that felt more like resistance than compliance. Her shoulders straightening inch by inch, her chin lifting last, and when she finally stood fully, she became aware of the distance between them, less than 2 feet, close enough that she could see the fine stitching at the edge of his coat. The subtle sheen of fabric that did not need to announce its worth, close enough to feel the stillness that followed him, not empty, not cold, but deliberate, as if nothing around him moved unless he allowed it. She kept her gaze lowered for one breath longer than necessary, then another, until the silence itself began to press, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and it was not shock she felt, not exactly, but something steadier, something that settled rather than struck. His expression did not change, not when she met his gaze, not when the entire room leaned into that moment without stepping closer. His eyes moved over her, not slowly, not quickly, but with the kind of attention that suggested he had already noticed more than anyone else in the room had cared to. The stain at the hem of her dress, the faint mark on her fingers, the absence of ornament where others wore excess. And then, without breaking that line of attention, he reached forward, not toward her face, not toward her shoulder, but to her wrist, the same wrist her cousin still held. And he did not pull, not immediately. He simply placed his hand there, firm, unhurried, and for a second there were 2 hands holding her, one familiar, one not, and the difference between them was unmistakable. Her cousin hesitated, just long enough for it to be seen, then released her, her fingers withdrawing as if the contact itself had become inappropriate, and the shift was small, almost invisible, but it moved through the room like a ripple. Eliza felt it before she understood it, the subtle reordering of attention, of permission, of who had the right to stand where. His hand closed around her wrist then, not tight, not gentle, but certain, and he turned, not asking, not explaining, simply moving, and she followed because there was no version of this moment in which she did not. The crowd parted without being told, space opening in precise increments, silk brushing back, shoulders angling away, conversations dying mid-thought. And each step he took placed her further from the edge where she had belonged and closer to the center where she had not been meant to stand. She was aware of every movement, the sound of her shoes against the marble, the weight of every gaze, the heat that had risen to her face now cooling into something sharper, more focused, and still he did not speak, not to her, not to anyone. He stopped only when they reached the center of the ballroom, the place where the light was brightest, where nothing could be overlooked, and he released her wrist, not abruptly, but with a slight pause, as if marking the end of one position and the beginning of another. She did not step back, though every instinct suggested she should. Instead, she stood where he had placed her, her hands now empty, her posture held together by something that felt dangerously close to defiance. And that was when the sound returned, not the music, not yet, but a single voice, amused, careless, cutting through the quiet with a confidence that had not yet adjusted to the change in the room. "Surely this is a mistake," the man said, a nobleman by his tone alone, his smile audible. Even without looking, "She has not even been presented." A few others shifted, a soft murmur of agreement, not loud enough to challenge, but enough to support, enough to remind the room of its rules. Eliza felt the words land without striking. They did not surprise her. They did not wound in any new way. They simply confirmed what had always been known, and she might have lowered her gaze again, might have stepped back into the role that required less attention. But the Duke did not allow the moment to move in that direction. He turned his head slightly, not toward the man entirely, just enough. And the motion alone was sufficient to still the remaining whispers. His voice, when it came, was even, almost quiet, but it carried with a clarity that made repetition unnecessary. "Good," he said, and there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, but intentional, as if the word itself required space. "I was not looking for one who was," and the meaning settled across the room in layers, not immediate, not simple, but unmistakable, and Eliza stood in the center of it. aware now that whatever had begun with a broken glass had not ended there, not even close. No one laughed after that. Not openly, not where it could be heard. But the tension did not disappear. It shifted, tightened, like fabric pulled too far across a frame. And Eliza felt it in the way people held themselves, in the way eyes lingered just a second longer than they should, measuring, recalculating, trying to understand what had just been altered without permission. She remained where he had left her, her hands at her sides, the faint chill of air against the damp fabric at her hem. Quiet reminder of how this had begun. And yet nothing about this moment felt accidental anymore. Not the way he stood beside her, not the way the room waited, as if the next movement belonged to him alone. And he did not rush it. He did not fill the silence with explanation. Instead, he reached toward the nearby table, the same one where untouched glasses still stood in perfect arrangement, and with a small, precise motion he picked one up, the crystal catching the light as he turned it once between his fingers. Then he extended it toward her, not offering, not requesting, simply placing it within her reach, and she hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because every eye in the room had followed the movement, because accepting it would mean stepping further into something she did not yet have a name for. But the pause could not last, not here, not now. So she lifted her hand and took the glass, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, the contact light, but unmistakable. And for a fraction of a second the entire room seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. Then it was gone, and she held the glass steady, though she did not drink. He watched her, not approving, not correcting, simply observing, as if the act itself had confirmed something he had already decided. A woman near the front shifted, her fan snapping closed a touch too sharply. Another leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a gloved hand. And across the room her cousin stood very still, her expression arranged into something polite and distant, as though distancing herself from the center might restore the order that had been disturbed. But the Duke did not return to the line of waiting women. He did not resume the expected ritual. Instead, he turned slightly toward Eliza again, his attention settling back on her with a weight that felt deliberate. "What is your name?" he asked, and it was not a question meant to invite conversation. It was a demand shaped into something quieter. She answered without delay, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had begun to mark each second. "Eliza Whitmore." And he repeated it once, not loudly, not for the room, but as if testing the sound of it. "Whitmore." Then a pause, brief, measured, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, not warmed, but focused, sharper, as though a piece had fallen into place where others had not even noticed a gap. He did not comment on it. He did not explain. Instead, he stepped half a pace closer, closing the space that had remained between them, and the movement was small, almost nothing, but it changed the frame entirely. The distance that had allowed the room to observe became something else, something more contained, more precise, and Eliza became acutely aware of how near he was, of the way his presence seemed to quiet even the smallest motion around them. The orchestra remained still, bows lowered, waiting, as if the signal to begin again had not yet been given. And in that suspended moment another voice attempted to break through, more careful this time, less amused. "Your Grace," a man began, older, his tone respectful but strained. Perhaps it would be wise to proceed with the introductions as planned. The suggestion hung in the air, polite, reasonable, an attempt to guide the evening back into its expected course. The Duke did not look at him immediately. He remained facing Eliza for one breath longer, then two, as if considering whether the interruption required acknowledgement at all. And when he finally turned his head, it was slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that made the interruption itself feel misplaced, as planned. He repeated, not questioning, not agreeing, simply placing the words into the silence where they could be examined. Then he shifted his gaze across the room, not lingering on any single face, but encompassing all of them at once, the women who had been prepared, the men who had arranged it, the structure that had existed before he entered and now waited to see if it would be restored. And then he stepped back, not away from Eliza, but to her side, aligning himself beside her rather than in front of her. And that, more than anything, drew a sharper intake of breath from those closest, because it was not a dismissal, not a temporary curiosity, it was a placement. And positions in a room like this were never accidental. Eliza felt it without needing to look. The shift from being held in his attention to being held within his presence. The difference subtle, but undeniable. And she did not move. She did not step back into the shadow that had once defined her place. Instead, she remained where he had brought her, her posture steady, the glass still untouched in her hand. And for the first time since the sound of breaking crystal had cut through the room, she understood that whatever came next would not return her to where she had been, not even if she wished it. And the Duke, without raising his voice, without calling for order, gave the smallest nod toward the orchestra, and the music began again, soft at first, uncertain, then fuller, filling the space that had been held too long in silence. But the rhythm had changed, the room had changed, and at the center of it, Eliza Whitmore stood where she had never been meant to stand, and no one in the ballroom could pretend not to see her now. The music returned, but it did not feel the same. The rhythm slightly too careful, the strings holding back as if uncertain how far they were permitted to go, and the dancers resumed with measured grace, though their eyes betrayed them, glancing, drifting, pulled again and again toward the center where Eliza stood, not dancing, not moving, simply present in a space that had never been meant to hold her. And the Duke did not guide her away, did not soften the moment by stepping aside. Instead, he remained where he had placed himself, aligned with her, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, as though the quiet disruption he had caused required no correction, only continuation, and that refusal to correct it began to settle uneasily across the room, the kind of unease that grew sharper with each passing second, until it could no longer remain unspoken. A woman approached first, not hurried, not reckless, but with the confidence of someone accustomed to being received, her gown a pale silver that caught the light at every angle, her chin lifted just enough to suggest both grace and certainty. She stopped at a respectful distance, but not so far as to seem hesitant, and inclined her head toward the Duke. "Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Perhaps you have been momentarily diverted." The pause was delicate, intentional, but the introductions are waiting. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Eliza, not lingering, not acknowledging, simply noting, then returning to him as though the correction were obvious, as though the room itself would soon right what had been disturbed. Eliza felt the shift immediately, the expectation tightening around her like a frame being adjusted, and for a moment, she considered stepping back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the long-practiced understanding of when to remove herself before being asked. But she did not move, not because she had decided not to, but because the Duke had not, and the stillness beside her held, deliberate, unyielding. He looked at the woman then, not dismissively, not rudely, but without the acknowledgement she had expected, his gaze passing over her with the same measured attention he had given the rest of the room. And then, instead of answering, he reached for Eliza's hand again, not her wrist this time, but her hand, his fingers closing around hers with quiet certainty, and the contact was different, more visible, more deliberate, the kind of gesture that could not be mistaken for guidance or correction, and he lifted her hand slightly, just enough to draw the eye, just enough to anchor her in the center of the moment. The woman's expression faltered, only for a fraction of a second, but it was there, the smallest crack in something carefully maintained. "You will proceed," the Duke said, not to her, not entirely, his voice carrying outward rather than forward. "As you wish." Another pause, brief, controlled. "Without me," and the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be redirected. The woman held his gaze for a moment longer, searching perhaps for a sign that this was temporary, that the structure would be restored once the moment passed. But no such sign came, and she inclined her head again, more shallow this time, before stepping back, her movement precise, her composure intact, though the absence of resolution followed her as she returned to the line, and the tension did not ease. It deepened, spreading outward in subtle, uneven waves. The orchestra adjusted, the tempo shifting slightly as couples resumed their dance with renewed attention to form, as if precision alone might restore balance. But the center remained unchanged, Eliza's hand still in his, the glass she had been given now resting forgotten on the nearby table, and she became aware of the warmth of his hand, Not intrusive, not possessive, but steady, grounding in a way that made the rest of the room feel distant, almost unreal. "You are trembling," he said quietly, not as an accusation, not as concern, simply an observation, and she became aware then that her fingers had tightened slightly around his without her noticing. She steadied them, not pulling away, not apologizing, only slightly. She answered, her voice controlled, though softer than before, and something in his expression shifted again, not visible enough to name, but present, as if the answer itself had confirmed a detail he had already suspected. He released her hand then, not abruptly, but with intention, allowing the space between them to return, though not entirely, never entirely, and he turned his attention outward once more, scanning the room that had not yet settled. The nobleman who had spoken earlier remained where he was, his posture straighter now, his expression less amused, more cautious, and others watched from a distance, their conversations fragmented, their attention divided between maintaining appearances and observing the shift that had not been resolved. And then, without warning, the Duke stepped forward, not away from Eliza, but into the path of the dancers, his movement cutting cleanly across the flow of the room. And for a moment, the nearest couple faltered, their steps interrupted, their rhythm broken, the man guiding his partner to a stop with a quick adjustment, their eyes lifting in unison toward the Duke as he approached. He did not acknowledge the interruption, did not apologize for it. Instead, he extended his hand once more, this time toward Eliza again, but from a new position, from within the space that had belonged to others, and the gesture was unmistakable, not a correction, not an exception, but an invitation that carried the weight of command. "Dance," he said, and the single word hung in the air, precise, undeniable, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold itself again, waiting to see whether she would step forward into a place that had never been meant for her, or remain where she had been placed, visible, but unclaimed. She did not take his hand immediately, not because she did not understand the command, but because the space between them had become something visible, something that every person in the ballroom could measure, the distance between a duke and a woman who had not been meant to stand in his presence, let alone step into his world. And for a moment, the music seemed to hesitate again, the rhythm continuing but softer, thinner, as if even the orchestra was waiting to see whether she would close that distance or leave it intact. Eliza felt the weight of it press against her shoulders, not heavy, not crushing, but undeniable, the expectation of an entire room balanced on a single movement. And she became aware of the smallest details, the way her fingers had curled slightly at her side, the faint dampness still clinging to the hem of her dress, the warmth that had not yet left her hand where he had held it before. And then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled steadiness that had carried her through every moment since the glass had shattered, her hand lifting, extending, and when her fingers touched his, the contact was immediate, precise, and the room seemed to contract around that point, as if everything beyond it had been pushed further away, his grip closed, firm, unhesitating, and in the same motion he stepped back, drawing her forward into the space of the dance, the movement seamless, practiced, not for her, but for himself, and she followed because there was no pause left to claim, no space to retreat into, her other hand rising automatically to rest where it was guided, her posture adjusting, aligning with his without instruction, and for a brief second, everything froze again, the two of them suspended at the edge of motion, his hand at hers, his other at her waist, the distance between them exact, deliberate, and then the music resumed its full measure, and he moved, not with flourish, not with excess, but with control, a step forward, a turn, a shift that drew her with him before she could anticipate it, and she felt it immediately, the difference between standing beside him and moving with him, the way his presence shaped the rhythm, the way each motion left no room for uncertainty. Her steps followed, not perfect, not trained to the same precision as the women who had practiced for moments like this, but steady enough, responsive enough, and that, more than perfection, seemed to hold his attention. He did not correct her, did not slow for her. He maintained the pace, the structure, and she adjusted within it, her movements sharpening with each turn, her awareness narrowing to the space they occupied together. the room beyond fading into something distant, blurred, and yet not absent, because she could feel it, the eyes, the attention, the shift that had not settled, whispers rising and falling beneath the music, not loud enough to interrupt, but constant enough to persist. And as they turned, the world reappeared in fragments, a woman's fan held too tightly, a gentleman's posture stiffening as they passed, her cousin standing rigid near the edge, her gaze fixed, not on Eliza's face, but on the Duke's hand at her waist, and then gone again as he guided her through another turn, the motion smooth, unbroken, his hand steady, his grip unwavering, and with each step, the placement became clearer, not accidental, not temporary, but intentional. A claim made not through words, but through movement, through position, through the undeniable visibility of where she stood now and who stood with her. And still he did not speak, not to her, not to anyone. The silence between them filled instead with the rhythm of the dance, the measured rise and fall of breath, the soft glide of fabric against fabric, until, without warning, he shifted again, not in step, but in direction, altering the pattern just enough that she felt it before she saw it. A turn that placed her more fully in the center, where the light was strongest, where the distance between them and the rest of the room widened. And for a fraction of a second, the movement slowed, not stopped, but drawn out, as if time itself had stretched to hold the image in place. His hand firm at her waist, her gaze lifted, the entire ballroom arranged around them, watching, measuring, and then the moment passed, the music carrying them forward again, but the effect remained. The image fixed in the minds of everyone present, and it was then that the tension broke into something sharper, more direct, a man stepping forward from the edge of the dance floor, not waiting for the measure to end, not waiting for permission, his movement cutting across the pattern in a way that forced those nearest to adjust, to step aside, to make space where none had been offered. "Your Grace," he said, louder this time, not disrespectful, but no longer careful, his eyes fixed not on Eliza, but on the Duke. "This is highly irregular." The word landed with intention, with weight, the kind that sought to restore order by naming its absence. The Duke did not stop immediately. He completed the step he had begun, guiding Eliza through the final turn of the measure, before coming to a controlled halt, his hand remaining at her waist for a fraction longer than necessary, anchoring the end of the movement, then releasing, slowly, deliberately, and turning to face the man who had spoken, his expression unchanged, his posture unaltered. "It is," he said, and the simplicity of the agreement seemed, for a moment, to open space for correction, for explanation, for retreat. But none came. Instead, he extended his hand again, not toward the man, not toward the room, but toward Eliza once more, palm open, steady, waiting. "And yet," he added, his voice even, unhurried, "we continue." And the words settled into the space like a decision already made, not to be debated, not to be undone, and the room, held once again at the edge of response, could do nothing but watch as she reached for his hand again, stepping forward into a place that had already begun to change everything around it. Her fingers met his again, and this time there was no hesitation left to hide behind, no illusion that the moment might pass without consequence. His hand closed around hers with the same quiet certainty, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something that carried forward the interruption, the challenge that had been spoken aloud and left unanswered. And he did not return to the pattern of the dance as it had been. Instead, he shifted, his step cutting across the expected rhythm, forcing a new line through the floor that did not belong to the music but bent it instead, and she felt it immediately, the change not in speed, but in direction, in intention, the way his movement no longer blended with the room, but defined it, and she followed, not because she knew the steps, but because there was no space left to do anything else, his hand guiding, his presence anchoring, and together they moved through the dancers who adjusted without thinking, bodies turning, steps faltering, space opening ahead of them in precise increments, and the room began to fracture in small, controlled ways, the symmetry of it disrupted, the carefully arranged lines bending to accommodate something that refused to be contained within them, and Eliza became aware of how close they were again, closer than before, his hand at her waist returning, not resting, but holding, steady, deliberate, the pressure just enough to direct without forcing, and her breath caught, not from fear, but from the awareness of being seen, not as she had been at the edge, but fully, completely, at the center of something that could not be ignored. And for a moment, the movement slowed, not stopped, but stretched, each step extending just slightly longer than expected, the music adjusting around them, and the room seemed to narrow again, every gaze fixed, every whisper suspended, until the next interruption came, not from the edge this time, but from directly ahead, a woman stepping into their path, not abruptly, but with a calculated precision that forced them to stop or collide. And he stopped, not because he had been halted, but because he chose to, the final step settling into stillness with a control that made the interruption itself feel smaller, and Eliza found herself held there, his hand still at her waist, her own still in his, the distance between them unchanged, the space around them tightening as those nearest paused, uncertain whether to move or remain. The woman inclined her head, not deeply, not submissively, but with a confidence that suggested she had never needed to lower it further. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm, measured. "This cannot continue." And the words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried, because they were meant to, because they spoke what others had only whispered, and Eliza felt them land, not as an attack, but as a boundary being drawn, a line that had existed long before she stepped into this room. And the Duke did not release her, did not step back. He did not even look at the woman immediately. Instead, he remained as he was for one breath, then another, as if allowing the words to settle into place before deciding whether they deserved a response. And when he did turn his head, it was slow, deliberate, the same measured motion that had already silenced the room more than once, his gaze meeting hers without acknowledgement of the challenge beneath it. "And yet," he said, his voice even, unhurried, "does," and the simplicity of it left no space for argument, no room for negotiation. The woman's expression tightened, not visibly enough to break her composure, but enough to be felt, a subtle shift that passed through the room like a change in temperature. And for a moment, no one moved. The dancers held in place, the music continuing but softer, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to resume its full measure. And then, without breaking eye contact with the woman, he moved again, not around her, not away, but forward, a single step that required her to decide, to yield or to stand. And she yielded, not abruptly, not obviously, but just enough, her foot shifting, her body angling, the space opening by inches, and he passed through it, guiding Eliza with him, the motion smooth, uninterrupted, as if the pause had never existed, and the music followed, rising again, filling the space that had been held too long in tension. And they continued, not in the center now, but through it, across it, his steps carrying them from one side of the ballroom to the other in a line that did not belong to the choreography, but redefined it. And Eliza felt the shift again, not just in position, but in perception, the way the room no longer framed her as an intrusion, but as a presence that had to be accounted for. And with each step, that presence grew more solid, more undeniable, until even the whispers began to change, less certain, less unified, as if the certainty that had once defined them had begun to fracture. And still he did not speak, not to her, not to anyone. The silence between them filled instead with movement, with control, with the steady, unbroken rhythm of something that refused to be corrected. And then, as the music reached its next measure, he stopped again, not because the dance required it, but because he chose to, turning her once more into the light, positioning her so that the entire room faced them. And for a fraction of a second, everything froze, the motion suspended, the music held, the room balanced on the edge of what would come next, his hand still at her waist, her breath steady despite the weight of every gaze, and the tension, unresolved, unyielding, settled deeper into the space between them and everyone else. The stillness did not break all at once, it fractured, piece by piece, as if the room itself could not decide whether to move forward or remain suspended in the moment he had created. Eliza felt it in the way the air pressed differently against her skin, in the way the music lingered just behind its own rhythm, the orchestra holding something back even as the notes continued. and she stood there, exactly where he had placed her, aware of the weight of every gaze and yet strangely removed from it, as though the center had become its own contained space, defined not by the room but by him, his hand still at her waist, steady, grounding, his presence close enough that she could feel the subtle rise and fall of his breath, controlled, unhurried, and for a moment, neither of them moved, not because they could not, but because movement itself had become a decision, and then he shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate precision that had guided every step so far, his hand pressing slightly, directing her forward, and she responded without hesitation now, her body aligning with his before the thought could fully form, and they moved again. But this time the motion carried something sharper beneath it, not just control, but intent, a clear, undeniable assertion that this was not an accident, not a moment to be corrected, but a position to be held. And as they crossed the floor once more, the dancers parted faster now, not uncertain, but aware, their movements adjusting before contact, their steps yielding without question, and the room began to reorganize itself around them, not restoring the old order, but forming a new one, quieter, less certain, but no less real. And Eliza felt the shift in the way people no longer looked past her, no longer dismissed her as part of the background, their attention fixed, their expressions measured, some curious, some disapproving, some calculating. And then there were those who watched with something else entirely, something harder to name. And she felt it without looking directly, the subtle tension that came from being placed where she had not been invited, where she had not earned her place by the rules that governed this world, and yet stood there anyway, held in position by the one man who could make that placement undeniable. And the music rose, fuller now, as if committing to the movement that could no longer be undone, and he turned her again, a smooth, controlled motion that brought her closer, not improperly, not beyond what the dance required, but close enough that the distinction between necessity and choice blurred, and for a brief second, everything seemed to slow, the turn extending, the light catching the edges of his coat, the faint movement of her dress following the arc of the step, and their eyes met again, not by accident, not by chance, but because the space between them demanded it, and there was something there now that had not been present before, not softness, not warmth, but recognition, clear, precise, as if the moment itself had sharpened into something that could not be ignored. And then it passed, the motion continuing, the rhythm carrying them forward, but the shift remained, settled between them in a way that did not need to be spoken. And that was when the pressure returned, stronger, more direct, not from a single voice this time, but from the room itself, the whispers no longer contained to the edges, but threading through the movement, rising and falling beneath the music, enough to be felt even if not fully heard. And as they turned again, Eliza caught fragments, not words, but tones, disbelief, disapproval, curiosity, the sound of a structure being questioned without being openly challenged, and it pressed in, not overwhelming, but persistent, and for a moment, her step faltered, just slightly, a fraction of a second where the rhythm slipped, and his hand tightened, not harsh, not corrective, but firm, enough to guide her back into place before the break could be seen, and the movement continued, seamless, unbroken, as if the falter had never existed, but she felt it, the small correction, the quiet insistence that she remain within the line he had set, and with it came something unexpected, not fear, not embarrassment, but steadiness, a sense that the space she occupied was being held, not by her, but by him, and the realization settled into her posture, into the way her shoulders aligned, the way her steps sharpened, more certain now, less reactive, and the change, though subtle, did not go unnoticed. The eyes that followed them shifted again, recalibrating, reassessing, and the room adjusted once more, not fully accepting, not yet, but no longer dismissing, and that, more than anything, deepened the tension, because uncertainty carried its own weight. And then, as the music approached its next rise, he stopped again, not gradually, not drifting to a halt, but precisely, the final step placed with exact intention, and he turned her into the center once more, positioning her so that the entire ballroom faced them again, the light falling directly across her, illuminating the details that had once been overlooked, the simplicity of her dress, the faint mark at her sleeve, the absence of ornament that now stood in contrast to everything around her. And for a fraction of a second, everything froze, the motion suspended, the music holding just beneath its peak, and he released her hand, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with a clarity that marked the end of one movement and the beginning of another, and the space between them opened, small, precise, but unmistakable, and he looked at her, not at the room, not at those who watched, but at her alone, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried, because the room had already learned to listen. "Stay," he said, and the single word settled into the space like a command that extended beyond the moment, beyond the dance, and she stood there, exactly where he had placed her, the distance between them now visible, the room waiting, the tension unbroken, as he turned away from her and stepped forward alone into the next movement, leaving her at the center of everything that had just been changed. He let go, and the absence of his hand was immediate, not empty, but exposed, as if the space he had held around her had been removed without warning, leaving her standing alone in the brightest point of the ballroom, exactly where every eye could reach her, and she did not move, not because she could not, but because the word he had given her had not released its hold. Stay. It lingered, quiet but absolute, settling into her posture, into the way her shoulders remained aligned, her chin level, her hands steady at her sides, and for a moment, the music continued without her, the dancers circling, the patterns resuming around a center that no longer moved with them, and the shift was unmistakable. The room had not returned to its previous order, it had reorganized around her absence from motion, around his presence elsewhere, and she became aware of him even without looking, the direction of attention, the subtle pull that followed where he stepped, and yet she did not turn, not immediately, because turning would mean seeking, and something in the way he had placed her made that unnecessary, made it clear that she would be seen without asking, and the pressure came then, not as a single voice, but as a movement, a narrowing of space, figures approaching from the edges with careful precision, not rushing, not confronting, but closing in, forming a quiet perimeter that felt more deliberate than any open challenge. Her cousin was among them, her steps measured, her expression composed, though the tension at the corners of her mouth betrayed more than she intended. "Eliza," she said softly, too softly for the room, but not too soft for the moment. "Come away." The words carried the weight of habit, of expectation, of a lifetime spent understanding where she belonged and where she did not, and for a second, the instinct rose again, the familiar pull to step back, to dissolve into the edge where mistakes could be forgotten. But she did not move, her gaze lifting instead, not searching for him, but holding the space he had left, and the pause stretched, her cousin's hand hovering just short of her arm, not touching, not yet, as if uncertain whether the right to do so still existed, and the room leaned into that uncertainty, watching, measuring, waiting to see whether the boundary would be restored or broken further. "You should not be here," another voice said, closer now, sharper, a gentleman whose composure had begun to thin under the strain of the moment. "This is not your place." And the words landed more directly, less disguised, and Eliza felt them, not as a wound, but as a fact that had always existed, one that had simply been brought into the open, and for a heartbeat, everything held, the music continuing, the dancers moving, but the center frozen, suspended between what had been and what might follow. And then she heard it, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the shift in the rhythm, a subtle change that preceded his movement, and before anyone else could speak again, before her cousin's hand could close the final inch, he returned, not from across the room, not from a distance, but from directly behind the line that had formed around her, his presence cutting through it without resistance, without apology, and the effect was immediate. The perimeter faltered, not breaking, but loosening, the bodies adjusting, stepping back by inches, by instinct rather than instruction, and he stepped into the space beside her once more, not reclaiming it, but reinforcing it, his proximity altering the balance again, his gaze passing over those who had approached, not lingering, not confronting, but acknowledging their presence in a way that made their challenge feel smaller, less certain. And then, without looking at her, without announcing the intention, he reached for her hand again, the motion smooth, inevitable, and when his fingers closed around hers, the room seemed to tighten once more, the lines of attention snapping back into place, and he did not pause, did not allow the moment to settle into stillness. Instead, he moved, guiding her forward, not into the dance this time, but through the crowd, across it, his steps direct, purposeful, and she followed, the space opening ahead of them as before, but faster now, more immediate, as if the room had learned not to resist what it could not control, and they moved toward the far side of the ballroom, away from the center, toward the long windows where the light softened, where the edges of the room blurred into shadow. And for a brief second, the intensity shifted, not gone, but focused differently, contained within a narrower frame. And he stopped there, turning to face her fully, the distance between them reduced again, his hand still holding hers, not tightly, not loosely, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined every movement since the beginning. And for a moment, the noise of the room seemed to recede, not silent, but distant, as if the space they occupied had separated from it. And he looked at her, not as he had before, not observing, not assessing, but directly, his gaze steady, precise, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, not softened, not warmed, but sharpened, focused, as if the question that had been forming since the first moment had reached its edge. "Do you understand?" he said, and the words were quiet, but they carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume, a weight that pressed into the space between them, into the silence that followed. And she felt it, not as confusion, not as uncertainty, but as recognition, the realization that this had never been about the dance, or the mistake, or even the room itself, but something else entirely, something that had begun the moment he chose to see her, and had not yet revealed what it would become. And for a fraction of a second, everything froze again, the light at her back, his hand in hers, the distance between them exact, and the entire ballroom held just beyond the edge of that moment, waiting for what would come next. She did not answer him immediately, not because she did not understand, but because the question settled deeper than the words themselves. Her fingers still held in his, the warmth of his hand grounding something that had already begun to shift inside her. And for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to recede even further, the music continuing but distant now, as if it belonged to another room entirely, and she became aware only of the space between them, the exact distance, the way his gaze did not waver, did not soften, did not offer explanation or comfort, only expectation, and it was not a gentle expectation, not one that allowed hesitation without consequence. It was precise, deliberate, the kind that demanded clarity, and she felt it press against her, not as pressure from him, but as the weight of everything that had led to this moment, the broken glass, the silence, the eyes that had turned toward her, the hands that had tried to pull her back, the space he had made and then held. And she realized, not suddenly, but with a steady certainty, that stepping away now would not return her to where she had been. It would only confirm what they had already believed, that she had never belonged here. And the thought settled, not as fear, but as something sharper, something quieter. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not falter. It remained exactly where it had been, controlled, steady. "Yes," she said, and the word was small, but it did not need to be larger, because the space around it had already learned to listen. And for a fraction of a second, nothing changed. His expression remained the same, his gaze steady, as if the answer itself had not surprised him, had not altered what he had already decided. And then he moved, not backward, not away, but forward, one step that closed the remaining distance, his hand shifting slightly, not releasing hers, but turning it, guiding it with a precision that felt less like instruction and more like placement. And she felt the change immediately, the subtle adjustment that brought her closer, that aligned her more directly with him. And then he turned, not toward the quieter edge where they stood, but back toward the ballroom, toward the center that had already been altered once and now waited to see if it would be again. And he did not hesitate. He did not slow. He led her forward, his steps direct, cutting through the space. with a certainty that left no room for interruption, and the room responded before he reached it, the dancers shifting, the lines opening, the conversations breaking apart mid-sentence, and the sound changed again, not silence, not yet, but a thinning, a pulling back of everything that was not him, not them. And as they reached the center once more, the movement slowed, not by accident, but by design, each step placed with intention, each second stretched just enough to be felt, and then he stopped, not gradually, not drifting, but with a precision that held the entire room in place, his hand still holding hers, his other at her side. And for a moment, everything froze, the music suspended, the light fixed, the entire ballroom balanced on the edge of what would come next. And then he released her, not completely, not stepping away, but enough to create space, enough to make the distance visible again. And he turned, not to her, but to the room, his gaze moving across it once, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not need to. "You have all seen her," he said, and the words settled across the room, not as an announcement, but as a statement of fact, something that could not be undone, could not be ignored, and a ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the shift of bodies, the intake of breath, the subtle recalculation of everything that had been assumed, and he did not pause for it, did not allow the moment to fracture into reaction. Instead, he stepped closer to her again, closing the space he had just created, his hand returning to hers, firmer now, more defined, and he continued, "Then you will understand." Another pause, brief, deliberate, "that I do not choose by presentation." And the words struck deeper, not because of what they said, but because of where they were placed, against the structure that had governed every movement in this room. And Eliza felt it. The words themselves had drawn a line that could not be crossed without consequence. And then it came, the response that had been building, not from the edges this time, but from within the center itself, a voice older, sharper, carrying authority that had not yet been challenged. "Your Grace," the man said, stepping forward into the space that had been cleared, his posture rigid, his tone controlled but no longer careful. "This is not how such matters are decided." And the words landed with weight, with the force of tradition, of expectation, of a system that had not yet accepted what stood before it. And for a second, everything held again, the tension reaching its highest point, stretched to its limit, and Eliza felt it, the pressure of it, the pull of it, the sense that the moment could break in any direction. And beside her, the Duke did not move, did not react immediately. He allowed the words to exist, to settle, to be fully heard. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward the man, his gaze meeting his without hesitation, without deference, and the room seemed to narrow around that single exchange, the rest of the ballroom falling away, reduced to silence, to observation. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, controlled, but there was something in it now that had not been there before, something sharper, something final. "It is now," he said, and the words did not rise, did not strike, but they landed with a certainty that left no space for argument. And in that moment, the balance shifted completely, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, the structure that had held the room in place bending, not breaking, but no longer rigid, no longer absolute. And Eliza stood at the center of it, her hand in his, the space around her transformed, not by her own movement, but by his decision. And for the first time, the room did not look at her as something misplaced, but as something chosen, and that, more than anything, changed everything. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and exact, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to forget how to respond, the structure that had held every expectation in place bending just enough to reveal what lay beneath it, something less stable, less certain, and Eliza felt it shift around her, not as noise, not as movement, but as a change in the way people held themselves, the way their attention no longer dismissed her but recalculated her, measured her against something new, something that had not existed before this moment. And beside her, his hand remained firm, not tightening, not easing, but steady, as if the decision had already been made long before anyone else understood it. And then he moved again, not away from her, not toward the man who had spoken, but slightly forward, just enough to draw the room with him. His posture unchanged, his gaze level, and the man hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But it was there, the smallest fracture in certainty, and the Duke did not fill it with explanation. He let it exist, let the silence stretch just long enough to make it visible. And then, without raising his voice, he spoke again. "You speak of order," he said, his tone calm, measured, as though it were fixed. A pause followed, not long, but deliberate. "It is not." And the words did not challenge, they redefined, and the room felt it. The shift from defense to uncertainty, from certainty to question, and Eliza stood within it, her breath steady, her posture aligned with the space he had created, aware now that the pressure that had once pushed her back had begun to lose its shape, its direction, and the realization settled into her in a way that did not require thought, only presence. And then he turned slightly, not toward the man, but toward her, his attention returning with a precision that narrowed the world again, and he lifted her hand, not high, not dramatic, just enough to bring it into the light, to make the contact visible, undeniable, and the room followed the motion, every gaze drawn to that single point, and for a moment, everything held. The music suspended just beneath its next note, the dancers frozen mid-step, the light catching the edges of crystal and silk and skin. And then he spoke, not to her, not entirely, but through her, his voice carrying outward. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the name moved through the room. With a different weight now, no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed, and Eliza felt it, the shift in how it was received, how it was held, and he continued, "Is the daughter of Thomas Whitmore." Another pause, longer this time, deliberate, as if allowing the name to find its place, and it did, not immediately, not for everyone, but for some. The recognition came in a subtle intake of breath, in the slight widening of eyes, in the quick exchange of glances that carried more than words could. And the Duke did not look away, did not soften the moment. "The man who secured the Ashford lands 10 years ago," he said, and now the ripple was unmistakable, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. The shift of bodies, the murmur that could not be contained, the sudden recalibration of everything that had been assumed about her place, and Eliza felt it like a change in air, the pressure moving, redirecting, no longer pressing her down, but circling, uncertain, searching for a new position, and her fingers tightened slightly in his, not from fear, but from the realization that something she had never claimed, never used, was now being placed before the entire room as fact, as weight, as value. And the Duke did not release her hand. He held it steady, anchoring the moment as it unfolded, and he added, quieter now, but no less clear, "A debt this house has not forgotten." And the words settled deeper, not as announcement, but as reminder, something that had existed beneath the surface, and now rose into view. And the man who had spoken earlier shifted, his posture adjusting, not collapsing, but no longer rigid, his certainty altered, his position less defined, and the others followed, not in unison, not completely, but enough for the change to be seen, to be felt, and Eliza stood in the center of it, her presence no longer an intrusion, no longer a mistake, but something that demanded acknowledgement. And for a moment, everything froze again, the room held between what it had believed and what it now understood, and then the Duke lowered her hand, not dropping it, not releasing it, but guiding it back to its place between them, the motion smooth, controlled, and he stepped closer, closing the space once more, his voice dropping, no longer meant for the room, but for her alone, though the silence made it audible all the same. "Now," he said, and there was no softness in it, no question, only direction, "You will stand." And the words carried a different weight now, not instruction, but confirmation, and she felt it, the shift fully realized, the space she occupied no longer uncertain, no longer borrowed, but held, defined, and she did not hesitate, she did not adjust. She simply remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her gaze level, and the room, watching, measuring, understanding in fragments, could no longer deny what had been placed before it, that the woman they had dismissed, overlooked, corrected, had been standing all along on ground that was not as fragile as they had believed, and that the man beside her had chosen not to elevate her from nothing, but to reveal what had been there, unseen, and in that revelation, the balance of the room had shifted beyond repair, beyond return, and nothing that followed would restore it to what it had been before. The reaction did not arrive as a single sound. It unfolded in layers, quiet at first, then sharper, the murmur of recognition moving through the ballroom like a current that could not be contained, and Eliza felt it shift around her, not pressing down as it had before, but circling, recalibrating, searching for a new place to settle, her name no longer slipping past unnoticed, but catching, holding, carrying weight it had not been allowed to carry before, and she stood there, her hand still in his, her posture unchanged, though something inside her had steadied, not lifted, not inflated, but anchored, as if the ground beneath her had been revealed rather than given, and the difference mattered. It mattered in the way her shoulders did not draw inward, in the way her gaze did not lower when eyes met hers now. And the room noticed. It noticed in the smallest ways, in the hesitation before someone turned away, in the absence of the quick dismissal that had once followed her presence. And the Duke did not move. He did not step back from what he had set in motion. Instead, he remained where he was, his hand still holding hers, not possessive, not gentle, but certain, as if the connection itself was part of the statement. And then the man who had challenged him before stepped forward again, not as abruptly as before, but with a care that had not been there earlier, his voice measured, though the edge beneath it had not entirely disappeared. "Even so," he said, and the words were chosen. Deliberate. Lineage does not determine suitability, and the attempt was clear, not to deny what had been revealed, but to contain it, to place it back within the boundaries that had defined the room. And for a moment, the tension sharpened again, not rising, but tightening, the air drawing in as if the space itself awaited correction, awaited the restoration of something familiar. And Eliza felt it, the pull of that expectation, the possibility that what had just shifted might still be guided back into place. And beside her, the Duke did not respond immediately. He allowed the words to exist, to settle fully into the space before he chose to answer them, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and then, slowly, he released her hand, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with intention, the absence of his touch immediate, visible, and for a fraction of a second, everything froze again. The room balanced on that single change, and then he stepped forward, not away from her, but slightly ahead, placing himself between her and the room without blocking her from view. And the movement was subtle, precise, but its meaning carried, not a shield, not a retreat, but a position. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not need to. "No," he said, and the word was quiet, but it cut cleanly through the space. "It does not." A pause followed, brief, controlled. "Nor does your opinion." And the room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the smallest of ways. The shift of weight, the intake of breath, the recalibration of posture, and the man fell silent, not forced, but answered. And the Duke did not look at him again. He did not pursue the exchange. Instead, he turned back toward Eliza, closing the small distance he had created, and for a moment, his gaze held hers again, not questioning, not confirming, but steady, as if the moment required no further explanation. And then he moved, reaching for her hand once more, his fingers closing around hers with the same quiet certainty, and he stepped back, guiding her forward into the center again. But this time the movement carried something final beneath it, not exploratory, not uncertain, but resolved. And the room felt it. The difference unmistakable, the way the hesitation that had lingered before no longer found space to exist. And the orchestra, sensing the shift, adjusted, the music rising, fuller, stronger, no longer holding back. And he turned her into the light once more, positioning her with a precision that left no ambiguity, her place not at the edge, not within the line of those waiting, but at the center, where every eye could see. And for a fraction of a second, everything froze again. The image fixed, her hand in his posture aligned beside her, the entire ballroom arranged around them. And then he released her hand, not stepping away, but remaining close, And he spoke again, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried through the room. "You will adjust," he said, and the words were not directed at any single person, not confined to one voice or one position. They moved outward, encompassing the room itself, and there was no command in the tone, no force, only certainty. And that certainty settled deeper than any raised voice could have, because it left no space for refusal, and Eliza felt it, not as pressure, not as demand, but as a shift that had already occurred, one that did not require her to prove anything further, to justify her presence, to defend her place. And the realization settled into her fully now, the understanding that she was no longer standing within borrowed space, but within something that had been claimed, defined, and held. And she did not move. She did not step back. She did not adjust her posture to soften what had been placed before the room. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her gaze level, her breath steady, and the room, watching, measuring, could no longer deny what had been made clear, not through argument, not through persuasion, but through action, through presence, through the unbroken line of decisions that had led to this moment. And the tension, though still present, had changed, no longer pressing toward correction, but settling into something else, something quieter, more complex, the beginning of acceptance that had not yet fully formed. And the Duke, standing beside her, did not look at the room again, his attention returning to her, not to confirm, not to question, but to acknowledge. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted once more, smaller this time, but no less real, the space between them no longer defined by distance or difference, but by something steadier, something that did not need to be named. And for the first time since the glass had shattered, the room moved forward, not returning to what it had been, but continuing from what it had become, with her at the center of it, not as an intrusion, not as an exception, but as a presence that could not be undone. The music did not falter this time. It carried forward with a steadier confidence, as if the room itself had accepted that it could not return to what it had been. And Eliza felt it in the way the air settled around her, no longer pressing, no longer testing, but holding, the weight of attention still present but altered, reshaped into something quieter, more deliberate. And she remained where she stood, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the place itself no longer rejected her. The light falling across her shoulders, the faint mark at her sleeve no longer something to be hidden, but simply part of what was seen. And beside her, the Duke did not move immediately, his presence still, controlled, as if allowing the moment to settle fully into the room before guiding it forward. And then, without announcement, he stepped closer again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a precision that drew the space inward once more, his hand lifting slightly, not reaching for her, as before, but hovering just long enough to mark the intention. And she responded without hesitation, her hand rising to meet his, the contact immediate, steady, and this time there was no ripple of shock, no visible fracture in the room, only a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that came when resistance had already been exhausted. And he turned her gently, not into the center as before, but into the flow of the dance, aligning her with the movement rather than placing her against it. And the shift was subtle but undeniable, not a display, not a statement, but a continuation, as if what had been declared no longer required emphasis, only presence. And they moved together again, the steps smoother now, not because the room had changed its rules, but because those rules had shifted around them. And Eliza felt it in the way her body responded, no longer adjusting out of uncertainty, but moving with a steadiness that had not been there before, her steps aligning with his without thought, her posture holding without effort, and the distance between them remained precise, controlled, but no longer defined by imbalance. And as they crossed the floor, the dancers did not hesitate. They adjusted, they yielded space not out of confusion, but out of recognition, their movements fluid, uninterrupted, and the room began to breathe again, not as it had before, but as something new, something recalibrated. And for a moment, everything felt almost still within motion, the music rising, the light shifting, the figures turning, and at the center of it, Eliza moved as though she had always belonged within that pattern, not because she had earned it in the way they understood, but because the space itself had accepted her presence, and the Duke guided her through one final turn, slower than the rest, the motion stretching just enough to be felt, and for a brief second, everything seemed to pause again, not frozen, but suspended, the arc of her movement held in the air, his hand steady at hers, the room arranged around them in a balance that no longer resisted, and then the moment passed, the step completed, the rhythm continuing, and he released her hand. Not abruptly, not with distance, but with a clarity that marked the end of something that had already been decided, and she remained where she was, her hands lowering naturally to her sides, her posture unchanged. And he stepped back half a pace, not away from her, but enough to create space, enough to allow the room to see her as she now stood, not within his grasp, but within her own place. And for a moment, no one moved toward her, no one spoke, the absence of interruption more telling than any reaction. And then, gradually, the space adjusted, a woman passing near inclined her head, not deeply, not submissively, but with acknowledgement. A gentleman stepped aside without hesitation, his gaze no longer dismissive, and the small gestures accumulated, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, each one reinforcing the shift that had taken place, and Eliza felt it, not as triumph, not as relief, but as a quiet settling, the understanding that what had changed would not be undone by the next movement, the next conversation, the next glance, and beside her, the Duke remained, not directing, not correcting, simply present, his gaze moving once across the room, not to assess, but to confirm what had already been set in motion, and then returning to her, not with intensity, not with question, but with a steadiness that mirrored her own, and for a moment, the space between them held, not empty, not charged, but balanced, as if the tension that had driven everything forward had not disappeared, but had transformed into something else, something quieter, more contained, and the music carried on, the ballroom alive again, but altered, and at its center, Eliza Whitmore stood not as an exception, not as a disruption, but as a presence that had been revealed, acknowledged, and left to remain. The rhythm carried forward, steady now, assured, as though the ballroom had accepted what it could not undo, and Eliza moved within it without resistance, her steps aligned, her posture unshaken, the faint weight of the evening settling into something quieter, something that no longer pressed against her but held her in place. And for a moment, the world felt almost balanced, the music, the movement, the light reflecting off crystal and silk, everything returning to form, though not to its former shape, and beside her, the Duke remained still, not leading, not correcting, simply present, and then, as the measure turned, he stepped forward again, closing the small distance that had been left between them, his hand lifting, not with urgency, not with force, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined every decision he had made that night, and she met it without hesitation, her fingers fitting into his as though the motion had already been decided before it was made, and for a brief second, everything slowed. The contact held in a moment that felt suspended, the room watching, the music rising beneath it, and then he turned, not toward the center this time, but toward the far end of the ballroom, where the tall doors stood closed, where the light dimmed slightly, and he guided her forward, his steps direct, unbroken, and the room parted as it had before, but differently now, not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with acknowledgement, the space opening cleanly, the path forming without resistance, and they moved through it together, not as something being observed, but as something already decided, and Eliza felt it in the way no one reached for her, no one called her back, no one attempted to correct what had already been placed, and the silence that followed them was not empty. It was full, heavy with what had been understood, and when they reached the doors, he stopped, not abruptly, but with a finality that settled into the moment, his hand still holding hers, his posture unchanged, and for a second, the entire ballroom seemed to hold again. The music continuing but distant now, as if it belonged behind them rather than around them, and he turned to her, fully, the space between them narrowing, his gaze steady, precise, and there was something different in it now, not sharper, not softer, but resolved, as if the question that had begun everything had reached its answer, and he did not speak immediately, he allowed the silence to settle, to define the space between them. And then, quietly, without ceremony, he said, "You were never misplaced." And the words did not rise, did not declare themselves to the room, but they carried nonetheless, because the room had already learned to listen, and Eliza felt them land, not as surprise, not as revelation, but as confirmation of something she had begun to understand long before he spoke it. And her breath steadied, not from relief, not from release, but from recognition, and she did not look away, she did not lower her gaze, she held it, meeting his with the same quiet certainty, and for a moment, everything froze again, the light catching the edges of his coat, the faint movement of her dress stilled, the doors behind them standing closed, the entire ballroom arranged in stillness. Just beyond, and then he moved, his hand shifting slightly, not pulling, not urging, but guiding, and he turned toward the doors, his other hand lifting to open them, the motion smooth, unhurried, and as the doors parted, the air changed, cooler, quieter, the sounds of the ballroom softening behind them, and he stepped forward, leading her out, not away from the